They climbed at 4,000 feet per minute, their Mitsubishi engines singing at full power, and watched the American fighters falling away below them. The Zero pilots pulled back on their control sticks with practiced ease, feeling their aircraft respond like living things, light and eager. It was the morning of August 7th, 1943, above Vella Lavella in the Solomon Islands. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, leading his section through towering cumulus clouds, felt the familiar confidence that came from flying the most maneuverable fighter aircraft in the world. The American planes, whatever type they were, couldn't follow. They never could. The Zero could outturn anything the Americans or British flew. It could outclimb them. At altitudes where enemy fighters struggled and wallowed, the Zero remained responsive and deadly. Sakai had proven this dozens of times over China, over the Philippines, over New Guinea. He had 300 combat hours in Zeros. He knew what the aircraft could do. But something was different this morning. High above, almost invisible against the deep blue of the tropical sky, contrails traced geometric patterns. Aircraft operating at altitudes the Zero rarely reached, altitudes where the air grew thin and cold. Sakai squinted upward, trying to identify them. The contrails shifted, turned, and began descending in steep, nearly vertical dives. The aircraft were coming down fast, faster than any dive he had seen before. They were not trying to turn with the Zeros. They were doing something else entirely. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Sakai witnessed that morning was the beginning of the end for the Zero's dominance in Pacific skies. The aircraft diving from above were Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, twin-engine, twin-boom fighters that represented a completely different philosophy of air combat. They were not trying to dogfight. They were using altitude, speed, and raw power to attack on their terms, not the Zero's terms. The Americans called it boom and zoom. Climb high, dive fast, shoot, and climb away before the enemy could respond. The Zero could not follow them up. It could not catch them in the dive. And it could not survive the concentrated firepower when the P-38s came screaming down from 30,000 feet. The question at the heart of this story is simple but profound. How did the aircraft that dominated Pacific air combat for 2 years, that destroyed everything it encountered in the war's opening campaigns, become obsolete? Not because it changed, but because the nature of combat changed around it. The Zero's greatest strengths, its incredible maneuverability and climb rate, became irrelevant when American pilots stopped fighting on Japanese terms. This is the story of how Japanese naval aviators, the best trained and most experienced fighter pilots in the world in 1941, discovered that their perfect weapon had fatal limitations they never anticipated. It is a story about design philosophy, tactical evolution, and the moment when confidence built on real victories collided with an enemy who refused to fight the expected battle. The Mitsubishi A6M0 did not appear by accident. It was the product of careful engineering requirements issued by the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1937. The Navy needed a carrier-based fighter that could escort bombers on long-range missions over China, defend the fleet against enemy aircraft, and engage in air superiority combat. These requirements seemed contradictory. Long range demanded fuel efficiency and light weight. Air superiority demanded maneuverability and climb rate. Carrier operations demanded strength and reliability. Most aviation experts believed you could not have all three. Jiro Horikoshi, chief designer at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, decided to prioritize range and maneuverability above everything else. Every component was designed to save weight. The airframe used a new aluminum alloy developed specifically for aircraft construction, stronger than standard aluminum but still light enough to meet weight targets. Horikoshi eliminated armor protection for the pilot. He eliminated self-sealing fuel tanks, the rubber-lined tanks that could survive bullet strikes without catching fire. He used fabric instead of metal to cover the ailerons and control surfaces. He designed the smallest possible cockpit, barely large enough for a pilot and his instruments. The result was an aircraft that weighed just 3,704 pounds, empty. When loaded with fuel and ammunition, the Zero weighed 5,513 pounds, roughly half the weight of American fighters then in development. That light weight gave the Zero extraordinary performance. It could climb to 19,000 feet in 7.5 minutes. Its maximum rate of climb was 4,000 feet per minute at sea level. It could turn inside any contemporary fighter, completing a full 360-degree turn in under 16 seconds. Its range was exceptional. With drop tanks, the Zero could fly nearly 2,000 miles, far beyond what any other fighter could achieve. The armament was adequate for its era. Two 7.7mm machine guns mounted in the nose, fired through the propeller arc. Two 20mm cannons, one in each wing, provided heavy firepower against bombers and ground targets. The 20mm Type 99 cannon was a licensed copy of the Swiss Oerlikon design, firing explosive shells at 600 rounds per minute. 60 rounds per gun gave the pilot enough ammunition for several engagement passes before needing to return to base or carrier. Japanese naval aviators who first flew the Zero in 1940 recognized immediately that they had been given something special. The aircraft responded to the lightest touch on the controls. It seemed to anticipate what the pilot wanted. In mock combat exercises against older Japanese fighters, the Zero was untouchable. Pilots could not believe how quickly it climbed, how tightly it turned, how far it could fly. When the first Zeros arrived in China in mid-1940, they achieved immediate and overwhelming success. Chinese pilots flying Soviet-built Polikarpov I-15 and I-16 fighters found themselves outmatched in every category except perhaps straight-line speed at low altitude. The Zero could climb above them, dive on them, and escape before they could respond. By December 1941, when Japan launched its offensive across the Pacific, Zero pilots had accumulated hundreds of hours of combat experience over China. They had developed tactics optimized for their aircraft's strengths. The basic fighting doctrine emphasized turning combat and energy management through vertical maneuvers. A Zero pilot engaged an enemy by climbing above him, diving to build speed, making a quick firing pass, then using that speed to climb back to altitude. If the enemy tried to turn and fight, the Zero simply outturned him and got on his tail. If the enemy tried to dive away, the Zero followed, using its superior climb rate to regain altitude advantage afterward. This doctrine worked perfectly against the opposition Japan faced in the war's opening months. At Pearl Harbor, the few American fighters that managed to get airborne were obsolete. Curtiss P-36, Hawks and P-40 Warhawks, neither designed for the kind of combat the Zero excelled at. Over the Philippines, American P-40s and P-35, as were destroyed in large numbers, often caught on the ground or overwhelmed in the air by superior Japanese numbers and tactics. Over Malaya and Singapore, British Brewster, Buffaloes, and Hawker Hurricanes proved completely inadequate. The Buffalo, a stubby, underpowered fighter originally designed for carrier use but rejected by the U.S. Navy, was slower than the Zero, turned worse, and had limited armament. The Hurricane, a capable aircraft in European combat, was designed for different conditions. It was rugged and could absorb damage, but it could not match the Zero's climb rate or turning ability at the altitudes where Pacific combat occurred. British and Commonwealth pilots found themselves in aircraft designed to fight German bombers at medium altitude over Europe, not to dogfight highly maneuverable Japanese fighters at 20,000 feet over tropical jungles. The results were predictable and devastating. In the first 4 months of the Pacific War, Zeros achieved kill ratios that seemed almost impossible. Japanese pilots reported shooting down 10, 12, sometimes 15 enemy aircraft for every Zero lost in combat. These numbers were inflated by the chaos of air combat, where multiple pilots might claim the same kill, and by the natural human tendency to overestimate success. But even accounting for overclaiming, the actual ratios were probably 6 or 7 to 1 in Japan's favor. That level of dominance was real, measurable, and psychologically devastating to Allied air forces. Zero pilots knew they were flying the best fighter in the Pacific. Their training reinforced this belief. Japanese naval aviator training was among the most rigorous in the world, requiring years of preparation before a pilot was considered combat-ready. Trainees spent months learning formation, flying, navigation, gunnery, and aerobatics. They practiced until they could fly their aircraft instinctively, without conscious thought. The pilots who flew Zeros in the Pacific War's early months were products of a selection and training system that had no equivalent in Western air forces. The Imperial Japanese Navy began pilot training before the war, with entrance examinations that rejected 90% of applicants. Those accepted spent 3 years in rigorous preparation. The Yokosuka Naval Air Corps, the Navy's primary training facility, subjected trainees to physical conditioning that bordered on brutality. Students ran 10 kilometers before breakfast. They practiced judo and kendo for hours. They swam in cold water to build endurance and mental toughness. Flight training emphasized formation discipline and precision aerobatics. Students learned to fly in tight formations, wingtip to wingtip, through clouds and bad weather. They practiced combat maneuvers until muscle memory took over, allowing them to react without thinking. Gunnery training used live ammunition against towed targets, with students required to achieve minimum hit percentages before progressing. Navigation training prepared them for long overwater flights, where a single degree of error could mean death from fuel exhaustion. By the time a Japanese naval aviator received his wings and was assigned to a frontline unit, he had typically accumulated between 300 and 800 hours of flight time, far more than his American or British counterpart. The Zero pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Malaya were not just well-trained, they were combat veterans. Many had flown over China for years. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, who would become one of Japan's leading aces with 64 confirmed victories, had been flying combat missions since 1938. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who may have been Japan's highest-scoring ace with over 80 victories, had refined his skills through hundreds of hours of combat flying. These men understood their aircraft intimately. They knew exactly how much speed they could trade for altitude, how tight they could turn before stalling, how to manage engine temperature and fuel consumption during extended combat. The Zero itself, despite its light construction, was not fragile in normal operations. The airframe could withstand 6.5 G positive and 3.5 G negative before structural failure. This was adequate for the sweeping, graceful maneuvers Japanese pilots favored. The Sakai engine, a 14-cylinder radial producing 940 horsepower at takeoff, was reliable and fuel-efficient. It could run for hours at cruise power, sipping fuel at rates that gave the Zero its extraordinary range. The cockpit, though cramped by Western standards, was logically arranged. The control stick fell naturally to hand. The throttle quadrant was positioned for easy reach. The gun sight, a simple optical device with an illuminated reticle, worked well in the clear Pacific skies. What the Zero lacked was protection. There was no armor plate behind the pilot's seat, no armored glass in the windscreen. The fuel tanks, despite holding over 200 gallons of fuel, had no self-sealing capability. A single tracer bullet striking a fuel tank could ignite the volatile aviation gasoline, turning the entire aircraft into a fireball in seconds. The light aluminum structure, while strong enough for normal maneuvers, crumpled under heavy impact. A burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire could tear off a wing or tail section. Japanese designers had made a calculated trade-off. They accepted vulnerability to gain performance. In the combat environment they expected, against opponents with lighter armament and shorter range, this trade-off made sense. Chinese fighters carried rifle-caliber machine guns that rarely inflicted fatal damage even when hitting the Zero. Soviet fighters encountered at Nomonhan in 1939 had heavier guns, but could not catch the Zero in sustained combat. The Americans were learning, not quickly, but methodically. After the disasters of December 1941 and the defensive battles through mid-1942, U.S. Navy and Marine Corps squadrons began analyzing Zero tactics and identifying potential counters. The analysis started with captured documents and damaged aircraft. In July 1942, American forces recovered a nearly intact Zero that had crashed in the Aleutian Islands. The pilot, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, had been killed in the crash, but his aircraft was repairable. Engineers shipped the Zero to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California, where it was restored to flying condition. Test pilots flew the captured Zero extensively, documenting its performance characteristics and identifying weaknesses. They confirmed what combat reports had suggested. The Zero could outturn any American fighter. Its climb rate was exceptional, but it had limitations that could be exploited. Above 200 miles per hour indicated airspeed, the Zero's ailerons became very heavy, requiring significant force to roll the aircraft. At high speeds in dives, the Zero's controls stiffened dramatically, making quick maneuvers impossible. The aircraft's light wing loading, which gave it superior turning ability at low speeds, became a liability at high speeds. American fighters, built heavier and stronger, could dive faster and maintain control at speeds where the Zero became dangerous to fly. The Navy disseminated these findings to operational squadrons with explicit tactical guidance. Do not dogfight with Zeros. Do not try to turn with them. Use speed and altitude. Make slashing attacks from above, fire, and break away before the Zero can respond. Use your aircraft's superior high-speed handling and diving ability. Never get slow in a fight. These tactics, refined through combat experience, became standard doctrine by mid-1943, but doctrine required aircraft capable of executing it. The 4F Wildcat, the Navy's primary carrier fighter through 1942, could implement these tactics only partially. It was rugged and had heavy armament, 6 50 caliber machine guns with substantial ammunition, but it was slow, barely reaching 120 miles per hour in level flight, and its climb rate was mediocre. What the Navy needed was an aircraft that could climb to high altitude quickly, dive at extreme speeds, and deliver overwhelming firepower. The Army Air Forces had such an aircraft. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had been designed in 1937 to meet Army requirements for a high-altitude interceptor. Lockheed's design team, led by Hall Hibbard and Clarence Kelly Johnson, created something radically different from conventional fighters. The P-38 had 2 engines, twin Allison V1270s producing 1,475 horsepower each. The engines were mounted in twin booms, extending back from the wings, with the cockpit and armament in a central nacelle between them. This unconventional layout gave the aircraft exceptional performance at altitude. The turbo-supercharged engines maintained power up to 25,000 feet and beyond, altitudes where most fighters suffered from oxygen starvation. At 30,000 feet, the P-38 could cruise at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour and climb at over 2,000 feet per minute. In a dive, the aircraft could reach speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, faster than any Japanese fighter could manage. The armament was devastating. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, concentrated their fire at a single point with no convergence issues. A 2-second burst delivered approximately 150 rounds, enough to destroy any aircraft it hit. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content, like this. The P-38 began arriving in the South Pacific Theater in late 1942. The first units equipped with Lightnings were Army Air Force's fighter groups assigned to Guadalcanal and New Guinea. Pilots transitioning from P-39, Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks found the P-38 challenging to master. It was faster, more complex, and required different techniques. But once pilots learned to use its capabilities, the Lightning transformed air combat in the Pacific. The key was altitude. P-38 pilots climbed to 25 or 30,000 feet before entering combat areas, spending 30 minutes or more gaining altitude while still over friendly territory. From that height, they could see for 100 miles on clear days, watching for Japanese formations below. When they spotted targets, the Lightnings dove, not the gentle dive-bombing attacks that Zeros could intercept, but near vertical power dives at full throttle, accelerating to speeds the Japanese pilots had never experienced. The attack technique was brutally simple. Identify the target, roll inverted, pull through into a dive, build speed to 450 or 500 miles per hour, close to gun range, fire a concentrated burst, and continue the dive past the target. Use the speed from the dive to climb back to altitude, where the Zero could not follow. Never turn to fight. Never slow down. Never engage on the Zero's terms. Japanese pilots encountered this tactic first over New Guinea in early 1943. The experience was profoundly disorienting. Zeros patrolling at 15 or 20,000 feet would suddenly take fire from above and behind. By the time pilots realized they were under attack, the P-38s were already past them, diving away at speeds no Zero could match. Pilots who tried to dive after the Lightnings found their aircraft shaking and bucking in the airflow, controls frozen, unable to aim or maneuver. Those who survived the first pass and tried to climb to engage found the P-38s already climbing faster, disappearing into the sky above. One Japanese pilot, whose account was recorded in post-war interviews, described his first encounter with P-38s over Bougainville in July 1943. His section of 4 Zeros was escorting bombers to Guadalcanal when tracers suddenly streaked past his canopy. He instinctively broke left, pulling hard into what should have been an evasive turn. The Zero responded perfectly, whipping around in a tight arc. But there was nothing to fight. The P-38s that had attacked were already gone, visible only as distant specks above and ahead, climbing away. His wingman was missing. He never saw what happened, never saw the aircraft that shot him down, just an empty sky where his wingman had been seconds before. The survivor tried to climb to engage, pulling his Zero into a maximum rate climb. At 22,000 feet, his aircraft was still responsive, but slower. At 25,000 feet, the controls felt mushy. At 28,000 feet, he was barely maintaining altitude. The P-38s were at 35,000 feet, circling like hawks, untouchable. The tactical revelation came gradually, then all at once. Through the summer and fall of 1943, Japanese fighter units across the Pacific encountered the same frustrating pattern. American fighters, primarily P-38s, but also the newer F-6F Hellcats from Navy carriers, refused to engage in traditional turning combat. They attacked from altitude with slashing passes, used their speed to escape, and climbed back to safety before Japanese pilots could respond. Every tactical advantage the Zero possessed, every capability that had made it supreme for 2 years, became irrelevant when the enemy simply would not fight on Japanese terms. Zero pilots tried various counter-tactics, Some attempted to climb to extreme altitudes before combat, hoping to meet the Americans on equal terms. But climbing to 30,000 feet consumed enormous amounts of fuel and time, leaving them with limited combat endurance once they arrived. The Zero's engine, not equipped with turbo superchargers like American engines, lost power steadily above 20,000 feet. By 30,000 feet, the aircraft was barely controllable, wallowing in the thin air with minimal excess power. Other pilots tried forming defensive circles, the classic fighter tactic where aircraft flew in a continuous turning pattern, each protecting the tail of the aircraft ahead. Against an opponent trying to dogfight, this tactic was nearly impregnable. Against P-38s diving through at 500 miles per hour, firing and continuing through without turning, the defensive circle just made targeting easier. The Americans could attack any aircraft in the circle from above, fire, and be gone before the formation could react. Some experienced pilots attempted to lure P-38s into turning combat by appearing vulnerable, pretending to be damaged or unaware of the attack. Occasionally this worked when American pilots got overconfident or made mistakes. But disciplined Lightning pilots simply ignored apparently easy targets, maintaining their altitude advantage and waiting for genuine opportunities. The fundamental problem was not tactics. It was physics and engineering philosophy. The Zero had been designed for a specific type of combat against specific opponents. When combat conditions changed, the aircraft could not adapt. Japanese engineers recognized the problem. Mitsubishi began developing improved versions of the Zero with more powerful engines, better armor protection, and heavier armament. The A6M5 model, introduced in late 1943, had a more powerful Sakai engine producing 1,130 horsepower, improved exhaust stacks that added speed, and strengthened wing structures that allowed faster diving speeds. But these improvements added weight, reducing the climb rate and turning ability that had been the Zero's primary advantages. The new model was faster in level flight and could dive more safely, but it no longer outturned American fighters as dramatically. It was a better aircraft by objective standards, but it had lost the characteristics that made the original Zero special. More advanced designs reached prototype stage but never entered large-scale production. The A7M Repu, intended as the Zero's replacement, had a 2,000 horsepower engine, much heavier armor, and performance that matched the best American fighters. Only 9 were built before the war ended. Japan's industrial capacity, strained by years of war and increasingly disrupted by American submarine attacks on shipping and B-29 bombing raids on factories, could not produce advanced aircraft in meaningful numbers while also building ships, submarines, and the thousands of aircraft consumed by kamikaze operations. The Zero remained Japan's primary fighter through 1945, not because it was adequate, but because nothing else was available in sufficient quantity. For Japanese naval aviators, the psychological impact of the Zero's obsolescence was devastating. These were men who had trained for years, who had accumulated combat experience when their enemies were still learning basics, who had dominated Pacific skies with an aircraft they trusted completely. Discovering that their weapon was no longer adequate, that they were being sent into combat against superior opposition with inadequate equipment, destroyed morale in ways that strategic defeats alone could not. Saburo Sakai, the veteran pilot who survived the war with 64 confirmed victories, described the transition in his post-war memoir. In 1941 and 1942, he wrote, "Japanese pilots flew with absolute confidence. They knew their aircraft was superior. They knew their training was better. They trusted their tactics. By late 1943, that confidence was gone. Pilots climbed into their Zeros, knowing they were at a disadvantage, knowing that American pilots could choose when and how to fight, knowing that survival depended more on luck and American mistakes than on their own skill. The casualty rates reflected this reality. In the war's first 6 months, Japanese naval aviation lost approximately 180 pilots killed or missing in combat. These losses were sustainable given the pool of trained replacements. But the training pipeline was already weakening. The rigorous 3-year training program that produced the elite pilots of 1941 required resources and time that Japan no longer had. Training was shortened to 18 months, then 12, then 6. New pilots arrived at frontline units with barely 200 hours of flight time, less than a third of what their predecessors had accumulated. They flew obsolescent aircraft against opponents with superior equipment, superior numbers, and increasingly superior training. In 1943, Japanese naval aviation lost approximately 900 pilots. In 1944, losses exceeded 2,000 pilots. By 1945, the numbers became almost meaningless as the kamikaze campaign consumed pilots and aircraft in deliberate suicide attacks. The Zero, designed as an air superiority fighter, ended the war carrying bombs on one-way missions against American ships. American pilots, meanwhile, refined their tactics and grew more confident. P-38 units developed standardized combat formations optimized for boom and zoom attacks. 4-ship flights operated in spread formations at different altitudes, providing mutual support while maintaining energy advantage. When Japanese fighters appeared below, the highest flight dove first, attacked, and climbed away. If Zeros attempted to climb after them, the second flight attacked from a different angle. The Japanese were forced to choose between ignoring the first attack and accepting casualties, or responding to it and becoming vulnerable to the follow-up attack. Either way, they took losses without inflicting comparable damage. The kill ratios reversed. By mid-1944, American fighters were achieving 3 or 4 kills for every loss, sometimes better. Japanese pilots who had once claimed 10 victories for every loss found themselves lucky to survive a few combat missions. The industrial disparity that underlay everything became impossible to ignore. American factories produced over 18,000 P-38s during the war. Grumman built over 12,000 F-6F Hellcats, the carrier fighter that replaced the Wildcat and proved equally capable of using energy tactics against Zeros. These were produced alongside thousands of other fighters, bombers, transports, and training aircraft. Japan produced 10,449 Zeros total from 1940 through 1945, and that represented a significant portion of Japan's entire fighter production. The Americans could afford to lose aircraft and pilots in training accidents, combat losses, and operational attrition. They replaced them faster than they lost them. Japan could not. Every Zero lost was irreplaceable. Every experienced pilot killed left a gap that could not be filled with an equally trained replacement. The story of the Zero's obsolescence is not simply about one aircraft being surpassed by better designs. It is about what happens when tactical excellence and design optimization for specific conditions meet an opponent who refuses to fight the expected battle. The Zero was genuinely exceptional at what it was designed to do. In turning combat at medium altitude against lightly armed opponents, it had no equal in the war's early years. Japanese pilots who flew it were among the most skilled aviators in any air force, but exceptional skill and optimized equipment cannot overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages when the enemy adapts faster than you can respond. The Americans learned from their defeats. They analyzed captured equipment, tested theories, and developed tactics that exploited enemy weaknesses while avoiding enemy strengths. They produced aircraft in quantities that allowed them to lose battles while learning, knowing they could replace losses and return with improvements. They built training systems that produced adequate pilots quickly, accepting that individual skill would be lower but compensating with numbers and equipment superiority. Japan could not match this approach. Limited industrial capacity prevented mass production of advanced aircraft. Limited training resources prevented rapid replacement of experienced pilots. Strategic bombing and submarine warfare progressively destroyed the industrial base and cut off access to raw materials. By 1944, Japan was fighting with weapons designed in the 1930s against opponents using weapons designed specifically to counter them. The morning flight Petty Officer Sakai watched, P-38s diving from 30,000 feet above Vella Lavella, was the moment when the old certainties died. The Zero could still outturn American fighters. It could still climb impressively at low altitude, but these capabilities no longer mattered. The Americans had changed the nature of air combat, using altitude and speed instead of turning ability, overwhelming firepower instead of maneuverability, systematic tactical doctrine instead of individual virtuosity. Sakai survived the war, one of the few Japanese aces to do so. In post-war interviews, he spoke about that transition with remarkable clarity. The Zero, he said, was the perfect weapon for the war Japan expected to fight. But America refused to fight that war. They fought their own war, on their own terms, using their strengths against Japanese weaknesses. No amount of courage or skill could overcome that fundamental reality. The Zero continued flying through August 1945, when Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast ended hostilities. By then, the aircraft was obsolete by half a decade of development, flown by pilots with minimal training, against enemies with every possible advantage. It remained a symbol of Japanese naval aviation, but a symbol of what had been lost rather than what might be achieved. The lesson transcends the specific aircraft and conflict. In war, as in any competition between complex systems, optimization for one set of conditions creates vulnerability to changed conditions. The side that adapts faster, that can learn and adjust and rebuild, holds the advantage regardless of initial tactical success. The Zero pilots who climbed confidently toward American aircraft that morning above Vella Lavella, believing their superiority was assured, learned this truth in the most direct way possible. They were still among the world's best fighter pilots, but they were flying yesterday's aircraft into tomorrow's battle. The outcome was never in doubt once the pilot. Americans stopped fighting on Japanese terms and started fighting on their own. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.